you'll love Mindful Moments.
Oh, yeah.
It's like a deep dive for your mind, offering a refreshing perspective on everything from science and philosophy to history and art,
Wow.
all in under 20 minutes.
That's great.
Yeah?
So if you're ready to nurse your mind on the go, check out Mindful Moments via the link in the show notes. Trust me, you won't regret it. You know, when we think about these big, powerful empires, we sort of picture them like leaving behind, these libraries full of their own histories and stories, right?
Right.
But what if I told you the civilization that really created, like the first true world empire, the Persians?
Yeah.
What if they didn't really do that?
Yeah, that's a fascinating point. We're talking about an empire of incredible scale, right? Like
Yeah.
sophisticated government, complex administration, all of that, but then relatively little from their own perspective, in terms of recording their own history.
Yeah, it's almost like they achieved all this, but were kind of quiet about it.
In a way, yeah. And it leaves us and you, the listener, with this interesting challenge. We have to rely primarily on accounts from others to piece together their story. And most notably, that means the Greeks.
Okay, so to be clear, for this deep dive, we're going to be exploring that first Persian Empire, those huge clashes, those epic clashes they had with the Greeks. We're going to be looking at a lot of Greek accounts, particularly, well, we're going to be focusing on Herodotus a lot. He's our main man for this one.
Absolutely. Herodotus is key here. But, as we kind of go through this, it's super important to remember that we're seeing this Persian story mostly, well, pretty much entirely through a Greek lens.
It's almost like trying to understand like a rivalry, but only getting one side of the story.
Exactly. And that brings up a really interesting problem, like a challenge in how we interpret history, right?
Yeah.
Because how do you really figure out a narrative that's essentially, well, it's lost, when all you have is what their rivals basically said about them?
It's a real puzzle.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, so for this deep dive, we're trying to do, well, we have a few goals, right? First, we want to really look at like the nuts and bolts of building an empire. Like, how do you do that? And once you have it, how do you keep it going?
Right, right, exactly. And then, well, second, we want to dig into how these two cultures, these massive cultures, clashed. The Persians and the Greeks. And the Greeks, well, they definitely saw it as like this fundamental difference, this East versus West kind of thing, which is in itself super interesting.
Totally.
Yeah.
And then the third thing, I guess, well, it kind of ties into what we were talking about before, but it's that we got to wrestle with this whole idea of like, okay, we're trying to figure out what happened way back when, but all we really have are these like limited sources, and they might be, well, they're probably biased in some way. So how do we deal with that?
It's like trying to put together a puzzle, but some of the pieces are missing, and the ones you have might be from a different puzzle entirely.
I like that. Yeah, it's a good way to put it. And you listening to this, well, you're kind of coming along with us on that journey, figuring out how tricky history can be, and we're going to try to do that while also telling this pretty amazing story.
It's going to be a fun ride. So why don't we start by, setting the scene a bit. Before the Persians were even really a thing, there were other empires in that region, right? I mean, the most powerful one was probably the Assyrian Empire.
Right. They were like the big dogs for a while. By like the late 8th century BC, they'd spread their influence all along that super important Khorasan highway. They were like the masters of that route.
Exactly. And they were taking tribute from all these different places. Stuff they needed. And those horses, especially from the Zagros Mountains, they were like gold to the Assyrians. They needed those horses for their armies, Those horses were like a huge part of how they projected their power.
Yeah, those horses were a big deal. But here's the thing, like empires, well, a lot of times they end up like accidentally creating the things that will eventually replace them. You know what I mean?
Oh, absolutely. They bring all these different people under their control, and then those people start to see what they have in common. They start to develop a shared identity. Like what happened with the Medes. They were one of these Aryan tribes, living in the Zagros region, and they were under Assyrian rule for a while, and they were famous for their horsemanship.
Yeah, the Medes.
Yeah.
They learned a lot from the Assyrians, especially about like warfare and using those horses to their advantage.
Yeah.
And, well, they eventually got strong enough to challenge the Assyrians. By the late 7th century BC, boom, they overthrew them.
It was a huge turning point. And that's where the Persians come in. They were another Aryan tribe, and they were initially under the Medes in this area called Anshan, which later became like the heartland of Persia.
Now, this is where our buddy Herodotus comes in. He's the one who gives us this kind of legendary story of Cyrus the Great. He was like the first big Persian king. And Herodotus got a lot of this from, Persian sources. You talk to Persians, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, it is. And one thing that pops up in Herodotus' account is this idea of a shared Aryan identity,
Yeah.
this ancient linguistic and cultural grouping that connected the Persians and the Medes. For them, it wasn't so much about being Persian or Mede, but about being Aryan, as opposed to an area, which basically means non-Aryan.
It's like their sense of who they were, like their tribe. It went beyond just like what specific kingdom they were from, and that probably made it a lot easier for Cyrus to eventually bring the Medes under his control.
Right, because there was already this shared cultural foundation. But it's not like it was a completely peaceful transition. Herodotus tells us about this rebellion Cyrus led against the Median king, Astyages. It's a story full of, like, intrigue and shifting alliances.
It's like a real Game of Thrones kind of situation. Betrayals, hidden agendas, the whole deal. And in the end, Cyrus wins, and he brings Media into his growing Persian Empire. It's interesting, Herodotus even mentions that some of the Greeks over in Ionia, they were so used to the Medes being in charge that when they saw, like, this guy Harpagus, who was one of Cyrus's generals, doing his thing, they just thought, oh, those must be the Medes. Like, they didn't even realize it was a new empire.
Yeah, it shows how, change doesn't always happen overnight. And it takes a while for, like, news and perceptions to catch up. But this early period, under Cyrus and then his son Cambyses, it reveals something really interesting about how they ran things. It seems like they tried to respect, the local customs and religions of the places they conquered.
Right. Like Cyrus, he's famous for letting the Jews who were exiled at Babylon go back home. And even Cambyses, even though he gets like a bad rap later on, he initially showed some respect for the Egyptians and their like traditions, but that didn't last too long, did it?
Yeah. No, it didn't. The image of Cambyses, it kind of goes downhill. He becomes this figure that the Persians remember as like cruel and haughty, a real despot. There are all these stories about him doing all kinds of harsh stuff, although it's hard to know how much of that is like true and how much is, maybe exaggerated over time. But it definitely points to some instability, some trouble within the empire, and maybe a move away from the more consensus-based approach that Cyrus had.
Yeah, it's like he lost the mandate of heaven or something. He went from being this like liberator to being this tyrant. And that brings us to Darius the Thirst, who comes after all this chaos. He's the one who really solidifies these core Persian ideas of Arta and Druj. Art, that means truth, like cosmic order. And Druj, that's the lie, chaos and all that.
Exactly. And after all the mess with Cambyses and then this revolt by the Magi, these priests, Darius basically says, look, I'm the one who brought back order. I'm the one who defeated the lie. It was a really powerful way to legitimize his rule. He wasn't just saying, hey, I'm the strongest, so I'm in charge. He was saying, I'm the one who restored balance to the universe.
It's like a PR campaign, but on a cosmic level.
Mm-hmm.
And it ties into the whole Zoroastrian thing, right? Zoroaster, he was this prophet, also an Aryan, and he had this dualistic view of the world,
Mm-hmm.
good versus evil, light versus darkness, the Ahura Mazda, the god of good against this evil being. And this idea that there's going to be this final battle, this apocalypse, and good will eventually triumph, that definitely influenced Persian thought, especially under Darius.
For sure. It gave them this framework for understanding the world and their place in it. And with that in place, well, the Persian Empire just explodes under Darius. I mean, it was already big, but he takes it to a whole new level. It stretches from the Khorasan Highway all the way across Mesopotamia into Egypt and even beyond. It was massive.
And to manage something that huge, you need a really good system, right?
Yeah.
Like, how do you keep control of all that territory?
Well, they were incredibly organized. And one of the key things was their infrastructure. They built these amazing royal roads, and their messenger system was legendary. Imagine, like, an information superhighway of the ancient world. They could send messages across this vast empire with incredible speed.
It's like the ancient version of the internet.
Yeah.
This has been, like, mind-blowing for people back then. And they built these impressive capitals, too, like Ecbatana, Susa, and Persepolis. Persepolis especially, that was like their ceremonial center, a symbol of imperial power. And it was all very planned and orderly, designed to project this image of harmony and stability, which is a big contrast to Babylon, which was like this older city, more organically grown.
Absolutely. These new capitals were all about, showcasing imperial power and control. And they had a clear policy of tribute. People from all across the empire, Arabs, Ethiopians, Gandharans, you see them all in these incredible friezes at Persepolis, bringing their offerings to the king.
It's like they were saying, look at all these different people who answer to us. We're the big dogs here.
Exactly. And generally speaking, they were pretty tolerant when it came to religion. They let different cultures keep their own beliefs and practices. It was a pretty pragmatic approach, like, as long as you pay your taxes and don't cause trouble, believe whatever you want. But there were exceptions, of course, like under Xerxes. They cracked down on those who worshipped the Daivas, these beings that Zoroastrians considered like demons.
Right. So tolerance had its limits. Basically, if they thought a particular religion was a threat to their power, they'd shut it down. But for the most part, they let people do their own thing, which is pretty interesting when you consider their relationship with the Greeks. Because, well, the Greeks and the Persians, they just didn't get along, did they?
Not really, no. Herodotus, he even asks this question in his histories. He's like, why do they hate us? And it's a good question. I mean, they were very different cultures with different values and ways of life.
And it seems like the Persians, well, they thought the Greeks were kind of a pain, always fighting amongst themselves, hard to govern. They thought they were obsessed with luxury. And, well, some of the Persian accounts even make fun of the Greeks for having long hair. Like, they thought it was effeminate.
Yeah, there was definitely a sense of like cultural superiority on the Persian side. They saw the Greeks as like undisciplined and chaotic. And the Greeks, well, they were developing their own sense of identity. You have the Spartans with their intense military culture. Everything about them was focused on warfare. They had this unique social structure centered around the homoioi, which basically means equals. These were the citizen soldiers, the heart of Spartan society.
And then there's that infamous Agage training they went through. It was brutal, designed to make them into the ultimate warriors. But the Spartans, they saw it as like the foundation of their freedom. They believed that this harsh system was what allowed them to be free, which is, well, it's an interesting way of looking at it. And we can't forget about the Helots, the people the Spartans had conquered and enslaved. They were a big part of the Spartan system.
Absolutely. And the Spartans, they were very inward looking. They weren't really interested in expanding their territory or getting involved in foreign affairs, at least not after they had a few, setbacks early on.
Right. They were more concerned with like keeping their own house in order,
Yeah.
which is very different from Athens. Athens, they were going through this radical transformation, becoming a democracy. They were putting power in the hands of the demos, the people. It was a pretty groundbreaking experiment.
And those two, Athens and Sparta, they had very different approaches to the Persians.
Yeah.
We even have accounts of an Athenian embassy going to Artaphernes, who was Darius's brother, offering him the traditional symbols of submission, earth, and water. It suggests that, there were attempts at diplomacy early on, even though they ultimately failed.
Yeah, it's like they were trying to like feel each other out, see if they could avoid a fight. But the thing is, the Persians, they already had control over Ionia and some other Greek-speaking areas in Asia Minor. So they were already butting heads with these independent Greek city-states. And to understand how these, different narratives are built and how bias can creep in, it's really worth checking out this YouTube channel called Mindful Moments. They do some really insightful analysis of AI audiobooks, which is really fascinating stuff.
Yeah, Mindful Moments is a great resource. And then you have the Ionian Revolt. That's really what sets everything off. The Ionians, with some help from Athens, they rebel against Persian rule. And from the Persian perspective, this was just like a blatant rebellion. They had to put it down, especially after the Athenians got involved. And so Darius decides to invade Greece. And that brings us to Marathon in 490 BC.
Marathon.
Yeah.
That's the one everybody knows.
Yeah.
That's the one where the Greeks, against all odds, they pull off this stunning victory. And according to the Greek accounts, the Persians were totally outnumbered. Now, whether those numbers are completely accurate, that's debatable.
Yeah, the Greeks were known to maybe embellish their victories a bit, but even if we take the numbers with a grain of salt, it was still a major victory for the Greeks. And it showed them that the Persians weren't invincible.
It was a huge morale boost. And it must have really annoyed Darius. So annoyed, in fact, that his son, Xerxes, well, he decides to launch this massive invasion 10 years later. We're talking huge armies, huge fleets. Herodotus gives us these crazy numbers, but again, probably a bit of exaggeration.
It's always good to be skeptical of those ancient historians. But even so, it was clearly an absolutely enormous undertaking. Just the logistics of moving that many people and supplies, it's mind-boggling. And then you have these incredible feats of engineering, like the bridge they built across the Hellespont and that canal they dug through Mount Athos.
Yeah, they were showing off. They were basically saying, look at what we can do. We're the Persian Empire, or we're not to be messed with.
Yeah.
And on the Greek side, you have these figures like Themistocles and Aristides emerging as leaders.
Mm.
And they had very different ideas about how to fight the Persians.
Right. Themistocles, he was all about the navy. He realized that the Greeks had to control the seas if they wanted to have a chance. But not everyone agreed with him. There was a lot of debate in Athens about whether they should focus on their navy or their army.
Yeah, it was a tough call. And then you have the oracle at Delphi getting involved. The oracle, she's always cryptic, right? She gives the Athenians this prophecy about a water wall that will save them. And Themistocles, he's like, aha, that's the navy.
Smart guy. And that prophecy, it really shaped Athenian strategy. They decided to go all in on their navy, which turned out to be a good call.
And then, boom, you have these simultaneous battles in 480 BC, Thermopylae and Artemisium. Thermopylae, that's the one with the Spartans, led by Leonidas, holding off this huge Persian army, a classic last stand.
Yeah.
But they were betrayed, right?
Yeah.
Ephialtes, that dude showed the Persians a secret path.
Yeah, Thermopylae is one of those stories that's been told and retold throughout history. It's a story of courage and sacrifice, but also of betrayal. And it's a reminder that even the most heroic efforts can be undermined by human weakness.
And while all that was going on, the Greeks were also fighting the Persians at sea, at Artemisium. It was a series of naval battles, and it was pretty evenly matched. But the Greeks, they eventually decided to withdraw, which made sense strategically.
They needed to regroup and figure out their next move. But it meant that the Persians were able to capture Athens. They sacked the city, which must have been devastating.
But the Athenians, they were already gone. They evacuated to the island of Salamis, which set the stage for the Battle of Salamis. And that battle, that was a turning point. The Greeks, thanks to Themistocles' clever tactics, they crushed the Persian fleet.
It was a decisive victory, and it must have been a huge shock to the Persians. They probably thought they had it in the bag, but the Greeks outmaneuvered them.
Big time. But the war wasn't over yet. The next year, the Greeks won 2 more big victories, at Plataea on land and Mycale at sea. Plataea, that was led by Pausanias, a Spartan general, and Mycale, that was fought in Ionia, which was Persian territory, so that was a big symbolic victory.
It showed that the Greeks were now on the offensive. They weren't just defending their own land anymore. They were pushing back against the Persians. And after those victories, well, the Persians were pretty much done. They retreated back east, and that was the end of their attempts to conquer Greece.
And the Greeks, they spun this whole narrative about how he had saved Western civilization from these, tyrannical Eastern barbarians. And the story of the Thermopylae, especially, became this, legendary tale of heroism.
But it's important to remember, as we said at the beginning, that we're getting all of this from the Greek perspective. We don't have the Persian side of the story. And that makes a huge difference. I mean, imagine if we only had, Confederate accounts of the American Civil War. Our understanding of that conflict would be totally skewed.
Yeah, it's like trying to understand a relationship by only listening to one person's version of events. It's just not going to be the whole story. And this idea of the Spartan mirage, it highlights how even our understanding of a major Greek city-state like Sparta is shaped by the limitations of the evidence we have.
Exactly. And the fact that we have so few Persian accounts, it leaves this huge gap in our knowledge. We don't know how they saw these events, how they interpreted them, and that makes it really hard to get a complete picture.
So what did we learn from all this? Well, the Persian Wars, they raise these big questions about how different cultures interact, about the challenges of interpreting history when we only have one side of the story, and about the lasting impact of these ancient conflicts.
And it leaves us with a final thought to ponder. How does this lack of Persian voices really affect our understanding of this period? What parts of the story are we missing? What perspectives are we overlooking?
Those are some great questions. If you're interested in learning more about the Persians and their clash with the Greeks, be sure to subscribe to our show for more deep dives into fascinating historical topics. And share this episode with anyone who might appreciate a fresh perspective on ancient history.
We'll also include a link in the show notes to Tom Holland's book, Persian Fire. It's a really great read, and it was one of our main sources for this episode.
And most importantly, keep thinking critically about the stories we tell ourselves about the past. There's always more to discover, more to question, and more to learn.